The plan to be victorious. Who will come out on top? Have you ever witnessed a chess game between two masters? The tension? The serene environment? Each player waiting for the other to make the wrong move. Exact is the situation between Russia and Ukraine. The Russian war is reaching its peak with each player doing the best and making all necessary moves to win. Sketching out plans and making allies are all moves to ensure victory. In today's video, we're going to predict who will come out on top or what's most likely to happen at the end of the war. Let's go. The war in Ukraine has turned into a lethal artillery duel, and whichever side can produce the most ammunition for the big guns on the battlefield could have the edge in the conflict, US officials and military analysts say. In its scramble for firepower, Russia is using ammunition that is half a century old and dismantling breast pumps and kitchen appliances to get microchips it needs for tanks and precision-guided weapons. Ukraine, for its part, is relying on the United States and other NATO allies to keep up the flow of arms and ammunition. But those stockpiles have been stretched 10 months into the war. Both militaries are burning through thousands of artillery rounds a day and are facing challenges to secure more supplies to keep up the fight. The struggle for ammunition pits Russia's defense industry, largely isolated by Western sanctions, against Ukraine's war-damaged economy and its supporters in NATO. Early in the war, one photo became quite popular. It was of a place card from a pro-Ukraine poster that read, "If Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine." Almost a year later, this still holds true. It is also increasingly clear that there will be no winners in this war and that Ukraine's future is ever more fragile. After its initial plans for Blitzkrieg failed in March 2022, Russia shifted its strategy. A devastating war of attrition with indiscriminate bombings and violence against civilians became one of its key tactics. Ukraine counter-offensives in early September marked the beginning of an escalation phase, in which Russia attacks on the Ukrainian civilian population and infrastructure intensified, including through the use of Iran-supplied drones. The amount of pain and damage that Russia can inflict on Ukraine, even during periods of military stalemate, at a relatively low cost and from a relatively safe distance, is shocking. According to several United Nations UN reports, the war toll on Ukraine by the end of last year was humongous. Around 18,000 civilian casualties, up to 40% of total housing damaged, and 50% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure destroyed or damaged. About 16 million Ukrainians have had to leave their homes, and up to 18 million people, or 40% of Ukraine's population, will need some sort of humanitarian aid in the coming months. According to the World Bank estimates, Ukraine's economy contracted by 30% in 2022, and as many as 60% of Ukrainians are expected to end up below the poverty line. Massive destruction of industrial assets and heavy fighting produced disastrous levels of air, soil, and water pollution, as well as damage to ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. Ukraine's resistance and its ability to use effectively all the military and intelligence support it gets helped compensate for a much smaller size of its military compared to Russia's. It has become clear that Russia can only win this war militarily through colossal military escalation. Many analysts believe it is preparing one for the coming spring. In the meantime, it will most likely continue to inflict damage on Ukraine. Since Ukraine is readying itself to mount further resistance, the war may turn even bloodier. External pressure on Russia is a double-edged sword. It may convince the Kremlin to negotiate as much as it may rise the stakes, and in turn Putin's willingness to bet more and employ more violent tactics. Russia's thought. Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategist Alexander Dugin asserted that Russia will either win the ongoing war with Ukraine or the whole world will be destroyed. Referred to as Putin's brain, Dugin said, "So, the war is of multipolar world order against unipolar world order. It's nothing either about Russia, Ukraine, or Europe. It's not against the West and the rest. It's humanity against hegemony." Dugin's comments came after Russian troops withdrew from Kherson, a Ukrainian city, last month, which was viewed as a major setback for Moscow. Our predictions. There are predictions that Russia's war on Ukraine will persist, but it could also end soon. Kremlin regime change, a Russian army collapse, or a Ukrainian win are possible. None of these contingencies should be ruled out. The West has crossed many self-imposed red lines. It was once reluctant, but now provides Ukraine with Stinger and Iris-T low-altitude anti-war missiles, HIMARS rocket artillery, and Patriot high-altitude air defenses. The United States and Germany have said they will supply infantry fighting vehicles. Despite this generous Western support and Ukraine's plucky military gains, pessimists are legion. Some foresee a frozen conflict. Some worry that Russian President Vladimir Putin will dig in his heels, viewing the fight as existential and denying Ukraine's identity. Some say he plans a long war or predict no one will win. The doubters may be right. The conflict has lasted longer than many regional wars, and no victory or retreat is in sight. Predictions merit only guarded confidence when so many have proven wrong. Example, that Kyiv could fall within days, or Russia would quickly gain air superiority over Ukraine. Policymakers might be prudent, however, to consider not only possibilities of a long war, but also how it might end sooner. Here are ways we think this great war might end with. Putin could fall. Putin's ex-KGB cohort in the Kremlin could be in trouble. A surprise, poorly executed draft of several 100,000 men has been unpopular. Defeats in Ukraine have sparked a torrent of hardline pro-war criticism. Some Kremlin insiders may be experiencing growing discontent. Putin could be pressuring or ousted by renegade security forces, such as those led by hardliners Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner Group, or Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. Abrupt regime change could be risky. Russia might become ungovernable. If Moscow persisted in its war, the West may continue to arm Ukraine, enforce biting sanctions, and control some $300 billion in Russian financial assets. Only liberalizers who withdrew forces from Ukraine might relieve the pressure. Russia's army could collapse. In World War I, a poorly motivated and provisioned Russian army collapsed, helping bring down an out-of-touch Tsar. Today, Russia might face a similar risk. While Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky visits frontline troops, Putin is mostly hidden from view, far from any fighting. No surprise that morale of Ukrainian soldiers is strong and that of Russians is weak. In some instances, enforcers shoot those who refuse to fight. In October, a British intelligence chief said Russian forces in Ukraine were overstretched and exhausted. Troops train at dilapidated bases, fight with obsolete equipment, and lack medical supplies. Soldiers complain of being sent into a meat grinder, some mutiny. During this winter, some might freeze without warm clothing. Ukraine's army could win. It repelled early Russian lunges to seize Ukraine's three largest cities, Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. Recently, Ukrainian forces took back half the land in eastern and southern Ukraine, which Russians seized in the second invasion launched on February 24th, including the only regional capital taken since then, Kherson. If the ground freezes deep and long enough, Ukraine's army might conduct combined arms operations to push deeper into occupied areas. Even Crimea could be vulnerable if Ukrainians seize the rail hub of Melitopol. Such initiatives might take place before the Russian army could train and equip a larger second echelon force, with the aim of conducting a renewed offensive against Kyiv or Kharkiv. Finally, there remains the specter that a desperate Kremlin might escalate the war, such as by direct attacks on supply and training bases in nearby NATO countries, or even limited use of nuclear weapons. The former option might be unattractive because of NATO reinforcement of its Eastern European flank and lack of Russian long-range precision attack munitions. The latter might be deterred in part by NATO nuclear maneuvers or by Chinese, Indian, or other international opposition. How this war ends remains uncertain. It does seem the West will continue to ensure that Ukrainian forces retain their qualitative lead in arms and access to Western intelligence information. A Russian mobilization of more conscripts, even if ill-trained and poorly equipped, could shore up Russian defenses. The stage might be set for drawn-out attritional warfare, but policymakers ought not to overlook contingencies that might seem unlikely but could end the war earlier. We have come to the end of today's video. Who do you think will emerge victorious? Do you think Russia is capable of a surrender? What if it escalates? Do well to share your thoughts in the comments section. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon to find out what happens if USA and Russia goes into war.